Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey guys, it's Debbie, and I am just giving you a little introduction on our guest today, Jay Feldman. He is a health coach, independent health researcher, and the host of his own show called the Energy Balance Podcast. He has degrees in neuroscience and exercise physiology from University of Miami. So he is one smart guy. He was going to medical school, but then quickly realized that conventional medical approach was not the solution for the health problems that so many of us face. So I think we all agree with that. Medical system does not help that. It makes it worse. And he also says that after working through various conventional and alternative health paradigms, that trialing and error on countless diets himself, his own experience doing vegetarian to keto, he came across this idea that cellular energy is a foundation for our health. He uses what he calls a bioenergetic approach to help men and women around the world maximize their cellular energy to optimize their health, achieve freedom from low energy symptoms like chronic fatigue, chronic hunger, cravings, brain fog, poor sleep, gut issues, stubborn weight gain. So Jay's mission, I always like to ask people what their why is. And he spent most of his life fighting against his own body, as a lot of us have. And we can relate to this. He spent years pushing himself hard in the gym, trying every diet out there, from vegetarian to low fat to keto to intermittent fasting, everything in between. All the while, he restricted himself and fought against his own body's natural signals and only ended worse off. And this is what I'm always curious about myself, if I'm doing too much fasting. And I've been talking a lot about this last few years. Before COVID, when you're fat adapted, you're really not that hungry and you don't need to eat as much. But are we pushing past that, being ketosis too long? Like I could go all day and I wouldn't eat until I got home from training and coaching clients and running around doing my own workouts, that I wasn't eating enough. I'm sure I was fasting too long and I wasn't getting enough calories in when I did eat because I was only eating once or twice a day. And I think we need to look at athletes when we're training high levels, longer duration, and being busy all day and moving, that we can have that calorie deficit. That can be another source of stress in your body. Fasting too much. And as I keep saying on my social media, Low Carb Athlete, if we're trying to build muscle and get stronger, if we're fasting too much and doing too much time restricted feeding, how are you going to hit those macros? As Dr. Gabrielle Leon says, hitting that protein goal of how many grams of protein to have per day depends on your goal body weight. So say you want to weigh 130 pounds is your ideal weight, then you should have 130 grams of protein per day, which is challenging for a lot of people to eat because we can take 30 to 50 grams of protein at a time to help build our muscle. But you can't do that if you're doing OMAD. You're not going to eat 130 grams of protein at once, unless you're Sean Baker. So you want to spread that out to 3 meals, or like I've been trying to do, a protein shake with all my superfoods and adaptogens in it, and frozen avocado, and then I'll add 2 scoops of protein in there. So I'll hit 40 grams, and then I have a lunch. That's my main meal, and then sometimes a dinner. But I still struggle trying to get 3 meals because I'm not hungry, and work days are busier. So it is a challenge to get protein in, and I think we tend to not listen to our bodies, and I think we need to take this information that Jay says and listen to his perspective. Are we doing too much? Less is more is not better is always my philosophy, and finding that Goldilocks effect for everything we do, finding that right dose to create a positive response. And why we stop to listen to those body signals, we lose that ability to be intuitive fueling and intuitive training that we get so stubborn because we're high performing, high charging, type A driven, ambitious individuals that we push past that point of, oh, I need to eat. And then we just keep going. Or maybe I need to exercise less. And maybe I don't need to go to bed so late. I need to go to bed earlier. Whatever it is, we tend to just push past everything and avoid those red flags. And we dig ourselves into a hole because we're accumulating excess chronic stress externally and hidden internal stressors that I talk about with lab testing that we reveal. Now, Jay has great information, something to think about. Let me know your thoughts and let's get a chat going on. If you go to the YouTube channel, you can watch our videos. I post everything there after I record them, and put something in the comment. I will respond. You can also just respond on the show notes and I will get message, or debbiepotts.net. And you can message me there or set up a call, discovery call, to see how we can work together. So maybe you want to take advantage of my new client special, or look at my auxiliary program, or what I call the VIP program, that we address all the elements of the holistic method to figure out what is the ideal program for you, and put in functional lab testing with that to look at markers where your areas of opportunity are and create the program that's personalized based on your goals and needs and races you're coming out with this. So I'll stop blabbing. Let's talk to Jay Feldman, but I'd love to hear from you. So let me know what your thoughts are after the show.
Hey, I kind of like my new office out here for recording podcasts. I'm doing it again. I got my nice little bucket hat on, flamingos, to keep the sun out of my eyes while I podcast. So this is my new look in the SoCal living lifestyle, North San Diego. And I am going to podcast with someone I've been intrigued about, Jay Feldman. And we'll do a little talk today about all things I'm kind of curious about myself, as I have the mantra, for a reason, less is more. More is not better. And if you've read my book, Life's Not a Race, It Is a Journey. And if you followed me, the podcast we've had for 10 years, starting back with Fit, Fat, Fast, 100 episodes in the archives on my website, debbiepotts.net, you'll know that I had kind of adrenal exhaustion, HPA axis dysfunction from doing too much. And we tend to be AAA, high charging, ambitious overachievers here on the podcast. And most athletes, triathletes, and endurance athletes, we tend to try to fit everything in on a busy day and burn the candle at both ends. We tend to have a lot of sources of chronic stress. And then we are overachievers. We hear these things on podcasts, blogs, social media, and we try to add them into our schedule, and we keep layering in more and more and more. Maybe they're healthy biohacks, but what if you're doing anything too much? Acute stress becomes a chronic stress. If you're doing something that's beneficial in a small dose, what happens when you're doing that small dose of stress all the time? So I always say in my book, it's like a faucet, turning it on, turning it off. But if it's a constant drip, 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 well, that's a different story, right? It becomes nonstop, ongoing, never turning it on, off. And that's what HIIT training is supposed to be. That's what fasting, feast, fast. That's what doing chronic cardio, doing it every day, too long. Maybe less is more, 45 minutes instead of hour and a half. So we're going to talk about that. I'm curious about fasting too much, especially for an athlete. The information we hear out there is designed for people that are metabolically damaged, not for us fat athletes and female athletes. So fasting too much, going too low of carb might be a stress on your body, especially when we look at this accumulation of stressors that we might already have a busy life. Your work stress is high. And then we add on excessive training, and then we add on another layer of eating too low of carbohydrates. Keeping it down 20, 50 grams total a day might be too low for you because you're exercising 1 to 3 times a day. What if you're doing more high intensity workouts? What if you are fasting too long? Because that's what happened to me. I was, once you're fat adapted, you're not really hungry. You don't feel like eating. And then we're so type A, we don't want to break that fast too early because we follow the rules of saying, hey, I'm doing a 16-hour or 20-hour fast. But then we stop listening to our body's red flags of when are we not listening to when our body actually could use some food and fuel that might make us perform better in our workouts as well as daily life and maybe your sleep. So measuring heart rate variability using your Oura Ring or Whoop Band to track your sleep scores, your REM, your deep sleep, your recovery. Heart rate variability, I think, is really important. We're doing a podcast with Dr. Jay Wiles on that soon. And I'm going to talk about finding that right balance with your blood sugar, stress, and recovery, repair, and fasting for athletes. So let's talk to Jay Feldman about his thoughts of less is more. And when we're doing too much, maybe, everything we're doing is wrong. But remember, it all depends. N equals 1. None of us are exactly the same. You don't have the same schedule that I do. You don't have the same workout intensity. We're never going to be exactly the same. And so that's why we want to look at all these different hacks and lifestyle habits and our nutrition habits and our exercise habits, and then customize them. And that's what I do for a living. I'm doing personalized nutrition and coaching for the elements of the holistic method, doing functional lab testing and writing out workouts for people based on their genetics and all their labs and everything else we can collect for more clues to put the missing pieces of puzzle together to really find the right workout for them. So let's find Jay and we'll continue on our discussion. So let me know your questions and thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. And I will do a Q&A soon for a solo podcast. And I can be reached at debbiepotts.net or Low Carb Athlete on YouTube, Low Carb Athlete on Instagram, where I mostly hold my information on there, hold, whatever. Okay, here's Jay. Let me bring him in. All right. I have Jay Feldman on the show today to get his opinion on how low carb is good or bad for us endurance athletes, how fasting might be too much hormetic stressors, and all of that stuff that I was talking about in the intro that is curious to me because we are high charging individuals trying to always find the right dose of everything to be effective. But I think a lot of times we do things that aren't ideal for us that cause more sources of chronic stress. So Jay, thanks for coming on the show and sharing your passion, your research, and your programs that you've been working so hard on.
Yeah, Debbie, thanks so much for having me on.
So talk about what's your why. I did your intro, but what drives you to keep up with this information, this research out there that you're trying to share this message? Yes.
Yeah. So, my interest in health started with my own health journey, and that certainly, led down quite a few routes of questioning and experimentation. My health journey started off with mostly an interest in fitness, and I was an athlete, and wanting to fuel myself well, to build muscle, to perform well, and that kind of drove this interest in health and nutrition and fitness. And so from there, I continued to learn, and initially it was a lot of what we're told, the mainstream, the low fat, lots of salads, whole grains, like the very kind of typical approach. And then from there, as I learned about how there might be some issues with some of those things, and dug into, the paleo movement, and eventually got into low carb and fasting and all sorts of different iterations there, right? The cyclical ketogenic diet. So you're not always in ketosis, and, trying to cycle in some carbohydrates with my workouts, and, but still very much falling into that kind of paleo camp. And it worked for me for a while, and until it really didn't, where I was left at a point where I didn't have the energy that I was promised from doing everything so well, doing everything right. And some things started to take a hit, energy, focus, performance at the gym, ability to build muscle, which I really didn't know at the time, but certainly found out after changing some of these approaches and seeing how much easier I could build muscle and strength. And things like sleep and libido and all the things that are supposed to be really top notch, especially, when you're younger, but also when you're doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing right. And so those things weren't exactly as they were starting to take a hit. And I was very much open to kind of questioning what was going on. And one of the biggest things for me as well was feeling a lot of hunger and restriction. And it wasn't necessarily just how much I was eating, but when you're fat, when I was fasting, I was always looking at the clock until I could get that next meal in. And, I was doing largely low carb at that point. So I was already fat adapted and all of that. And, but just couldn't wait till the next meal. And as soon as I ate, I was waiting to eat my next meal and really trying to portion things out. And I was very much looking for a way out of that as well. I didn't necessarily know it, but if you had asked me, I would have said I was totally fine and happy and healthy and all of that. But I was very hungry and restricted, looking back. And so as soon as I was I was introduced to or discovered some new approaches toward looking at all of this, at health and physiology, I was, and that new approach involved having a little bit more as far as carbohydrates go, especially, the light bulb went off, and also I was ready to jump into it. And so that really changed everything for me. It completely shifted the way I was looking at health, shifting from this view of needing to fight against our bodies, that the way that we get healthier is by stressing ourselves, fighting against the natural desires for carbohydrates or just for food in general. And, you really have to oppose your body's kind of natural responses and signals. And so it really flipped all that on its head and started to suggest that actually our body's signals are there for a reason, and we can actually listen to them and work with them. And that can actually lead us to health. And so that completely changed the way I was doing things, and has, you asked kind of the why for doing this. And more than anything, it's wanting to help people who are in that position that I was in to realize that they don't have to be there anymore. And you can actually feel good and satiated and content physically and mentally, and also have all the health effects you're looking for, the health benefits you're looking for.
So is it more looking at a personalized program that, we are all unique individuals. There is not one size fits all approach. So sometimes, doing certain macro ratio or fasting window, time restricted eating and feeding, and the hormetic stressors we'll talk about, sometimes they work for some, but then others might not. And would that be correlated to excessive sources of chronic stress, external and internally, that are accumulating for that individual?
So individuality is a huge part of it, right? And we all need to consider our own individual context, where we're at physiologically, and how much stress we do have at any moment. But I also think there was some major shifts that I made in terms of the way that I looked at health, in terms of those underlying principles, where the kind of prior underlying principle being that stress and restriction and opposing our, fighting against our bodies is the way to health, as opposed to an alternative view here that the true fundamental driver of our health is energy, the physiological energy on that cellular level. And our body signals are all designed to increase that. And assuming that we listen and adjust based on those signals in an intelligent way, then we can basically have our cake and eat it too, if you will. And it's of course we need to consider the individuality, but I also think that there are certain principles that, regardless of the individual, are not going to be supportive of our health. And I think a lot of the things that are often suggested in this alternative health world do fall into that umbrella.
So let's divide this up into my tagline, 3 different areas: fat loss, and then performance for endurance athlete, and then longevity. So let's start with fat loss. What's your message and lessons learned, and what you're sharing, the best way to lose fat for those who are interested in burning that excess fat off?
Yeah, so at least as far as the top level approach goes, right? There is difference individually as far as how we're going to, how we might apply some of these principles. But as far as the kind of big picture goes, I think the general view that fat, like being overweight, is the product of excess energy, and that we need to reduce energy. We need to create an energy deficit to lose weight, is entirely off base. I think it's a really, really, not only is it incorrect, but I think it's really harmful way to look at fat loss or fat gain. And I think there's a really important distinction that needs to be made between the calories that are coming in, which you could think of as fuel, and the energy that is then converted to. Right. And there's a lot of steps in that process, right? We have the food coming in, we have to be able to break it down in our digestive tract. So we have to digest it. Then we have to be able to absorb it. Then we have to assimilate in all sorts of ways. And then it might be decided that this is a good fuel. And then we have to convert that fuel to energy, which sometimes goes really well and sometimes doesn't. And so when we're looking at how that leads to fat gain or loss, if we're not converting that food to energy very well, then we'll end up with some excess fuel that will then have to be stored as body fat. But that's very different from the alternative idea that the energy gets full first, and then there's a spillover of fuel into body fat. And so instead, there are a ton of things that block that conversion from fuel to energy, everything from the types of fats that are coming in, a lack of particular nutrients, certain forms of stress, all sorts of issues with gut irritation and permeability, and on from there, that can all inhibit that process that converts fuel to energy. That's the mitochondrial respiration. Everyone's talking about mitochondrial health. There's a ton of ways that can go wrong. And when it does, then we have all this extra fuel that's not being converted to energy, and then it gets stored as body fat. So my focus when it comes to fat loss is on improving that conversion from fuel to energy so that we have enough energy and we're storing less fuel as fat.
So is this what you call the bioenergetic approach to working with people?
The bioenergetic approach is looking at health through that lens of the production of energy. And that energy, it's something that's important when it comes to fat loss. It's also something that's important when it comes to cognitive function, digestive function, reproductive function. These are all these bodily systems, of course, rely on a certain amount of energy. And when our bodies don't have that energy available, they turn down the dials for those different systems. They reduce the energy usage to conserve fuel. It's a normal starvation, famine mechanism, involves turning down the thyroid activity, reducing our reproductive activity, and on from there. And so the larger view here, this larger bioenergetic view, is that if we are doing the things that improve the availability of energy, that will lead to improvements in all of these areas of health. And then it also includes weight loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because do you like to look at lab testing with that too? So functional labs are saying like a GI map type of test and Dutch test. Are you looking at that whole picture to figure out where that person needs to start to figure out their balance to get fat burning fuel improved?
So there's a lot of value in getting those different tests, whether it is looking at gut health or blood tests, right? Or a Dutch test or something like that. I think that we can use all those things together to create a picture of what's going on physiologically. We can also use how someone's feeling and what their symptoms are. Are they sleeping through the night? How is their blood sugar regulation? What are their digestive symptoms? Those things can give us a ton of clues as to what's going on. So I think there's a place for the testing to see if we're improving or to help if we're unsure what areas might need to be kind of focused on a little bit more. But I think also when we're looking at an individual, a lot of times we're going to be able to tell what's, based on their symptoms, what might be driving their issues.
Mm-hmm. So with fat metabolism, and I just was saying I got back from KetoCon conference the other week, and that people are speaking of protein and getting your fat, so kind of keto carnivore, and Dr. Gabrielle Leon saying you need to hit 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal. And so spreading that out throughout the day. So not fasting. And then there's others that are, doing intermittent fasting, the 16-8 or 18 or OMAD. Where do you think, protein and fat and carbs come in for an individual? But then there's also our audience is the endurance athlete doing, say, triathlons that they're swim, bike, run, and lifting weights, hopefully, and working out multiple times a week or a day. So carb timing we'll get to, but carbs, fat, protein, what's your thought of that for fat loss?
So if we're just talking fat loss, maybe it's helpful just to keep it in that lens as opposed to maybe performance, which we can come to second. But the idea that fat burning leads to fat loss and that insulin and carbohydrates lead to fat gain is an extremely oversimplified and not accurate message. And I'm not saying that. You're saying that a lot of people are not. A lot of people are kind of digging into the details there, but I think sometimes that's the takeaway. Is that all we need to do is burn some more fat and that'll lead to fat loss. And if we're keeping the insulin to a minimum and keeping the carbs to a minimum, that leads to fat gain. And there are more than enough metabolic ward studies and on from there that show us that if you're eating the same, and so there's one in particular that I reference quite often, which is by Kevin Hull. And so he had one group that was on a low carb, high fat diet, another group that was on a low fat, high carb diet, and they're on the same number of calories. And during that time, both groups lost weight, but the low carb, high fat diet, which had way higher levels of fat burning, way lower levels of insulin, lost less body fat. and lost more fat-free mass. And I think, again, metabolic ward, we're able to very directly measure everything. And, the biggest kind of response that I hear there is that from the low carb crowd is that they took away the biggest variable that's beneficial on low carb, which is that it allows you to decrease your calories easier, which is fine, but it's a very different argument from just burning fat equals fat loss. And so that study alone, and there's a lot of other pieces to kind of that fit in here, but that study alone shows us that just increasing fat burning doesn't say if we're going to lose fat, because it ignores the other side of the equation, which is the fat coming into storage. So if we have insulin, insulin's low, carbs are low. So yes, the fat stores aren't going to be taking up carbs, but they're still taking up fat, whether it's fat that we're consuming or fat that's released from other fat stores. And so this idea that all we need to do is burn fat to lose fat is really missing this whole other side of the equation, which is what leads to the storage of fat, what leads to the fat coming into the fat stores. And that's when we need to look at things like stress hormones, especially, cortisol being known as one of the major ones. Also, but other ones play a role as well. And I think another very commonly, like a common association, is just that cortisol is a result of psychological stress. And that's kind of how it's made to sound. But cortisol is a physiological stress response, or the response of physiological stress. And it's produced by psychological stress, or it's because we went for a really long run. And of course, that short-term cortisol in either case is incredibly necessary, very helpful. We need to have it there. But if we're doing the things that are driving excess levels of stress hormones over time, it'll also increase fat storage. And we see that very clearly, right, in like the extreme example of Cushing's syndrome or disease, where you're seeing, excess body fat in a situation where there's very high levels of cortisol. And so my focus, instead of saying we just need to burn as much fat as possible, is to say, let's reduce the amount of fat that's going into storage. And one of the main ways that we do that is improve the conversion from the fuel to energy. So I know you asked about macronutrients. To come back to that question, the reason why I was kind of prefacing it by all that is because I'm not a fan of the low carb, high fat approach, whether it's just for fat loss or for other reasons. Yeah. And that's because the carbohydrates are absolutely essential for brain health. At least 50 to 60% of our brain needs are going to have to be met by glucose. But if we're not in a ketogenic state, it's nearly 100%. And for liver health and on, I think there's a very important argument for carbohydrates, but also for keeping those stress hormones down and keeping the thyroid hormones up, and also improving the conversion of the inactive to active thyroid hormones. The reason why I'm touching on those thyroid hormones is those are the main regulators of our metabolic rate. So if we get our metabolism up, keep the stress hormones down, I think carbs are a big part of that. That will allow us to lose body fat, and I much prefer to go that route.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people think carbs are, which I spoke in my seminar, that all carbs are evil. And Rob Wolf talks about strategic carbs and carb tolerance, and that, in the athletic world, they've gotten to be that all carbs are bad. And it's really more clarifying which are real food carb sources, is get rid of the refined flours and the sugars and the muffins and the chips and the cakes and, all that stuff, and eat real food. If it's more the safe starches, underground vegetables and root vegetables, stuff like that, versus packaged food. So I don't like to clarify. I don't like to say that I said this in a post yesterday, keto or carnivore, put a name on it. It's more eat nutrient dense food that gives you, good nutrition that balances your blood sugar, and timing those carbs where it depends, for me personally, on my workout that day and what my body feels like it needs. So do you think that it's, carb timing and where to place them that gives you the best results from that, so you're not having blood sugar spikes? Little delay. Jay, you hear me?
I think we're caught up. I think I got most of your question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Debbie?
Yeah, go ahead. So what would you say?
Okay, I'm going to go.
Yeah, go.
So I think it is important to tailor carb intake to carb tolerance, right? If somebody is very considerably insulin resistant, meaning that they're not able to metabolize those carbohydrates well, their glucose metabolism is inhibited, they're not converting the carbohydrates to energy, we don't want to be dumping in tons and tons of carbohydrates, of course. And on the other side, if you're pretty carb tolerant, I think it can be really, really helpful to have a lot of carbohydrates. And normally if someone is on, in the generally fit and athletic side of things, they're definitely going to be pretty carb tolerant. Not always, but the vast majority of the time. And a lot of times on the in-between stages as well, I think it's still really helpful to have a lot of carbohydrates. But we do need to tailor it to carb tolerance. If someone is having some pretty dramatic responses in terms of blood sugar when they're having carbs, they might not be metabolizing them as well. And we want to take that into consideration for sure. The other point I wanted to get at here is, of course, I was talking about low carb and fat burning and fat loss. And I do want to make the point here, because it ties in with the carbohydrates, which is that a lot of people do lose fat when they cut out carbohydrates. And there's two main reasons for that I would say are not, well, one, that is the fat burning, and I'll explain why, but the other is not fat burning. And the main reason I would say is not fat burning is because of the improvements in gut health, the relief to gut, in terms of gut issues and gut dysfunction. So you mentioned all of these problematic forms of carbohydrates, whether it's grains or processed flours or on from there. And those will definitely create some gut issues. And so removing those and removing any potential driver of gut issues will bring a ton of relief health-wise, but also fat loss-wise. And so that's a huge part. And the other part is if someone is very insulin resistant, like they're type 2 diabetic, and you remove the carbohydrates that they were trying to still use, even though they can't use them well, that can be helpful as well. But so when it comes to the carbohydrates, this doesn't mean that the carbs are the problem. It just means we want to make sure that we're tailoring them to our tolerance, improving our tolerance, and choosing the ones that are digested well, absorbed well, and generally have a lot of nutrition. And so you mentioned the root vegetables and those forms of starches, which I think are great. I would also put ripe fruit into that mix as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're looking at more at reducing the stress hormones, cortisol, which I just did a video of today, and improving our thyroid health. So the HPA axis is hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. But then, when adrenal cortisol is up, usually we've got increase in reverse T3 and the thyroid is put on hold. So getting those hormones in balance, which will relate to insulin resistance too, and working on, say, the pancreas, adrenals, liver function, all of that will help our fat metabolism more so than adding in higher fat and keeping the carbs lower.
Yeah, it'll help our metabolism overall. It'll help our carb metabolism and our fat metabolism too. But normally my focus is more on being able to metabolize those carbs well, because that is the sign of generally of health, right? When someone is struggling, they're insulin resistant, they've got fatty liver disease, on and on, they've got the Alzheimer's, what's called the type 3 diabetes now. Those are all states of impaired carb metabolism, and they tend to rely on excess fat metabolism in those cases. So I don't see necessarily focus on improving fat metabolism, but rather carb metabolism being the one that fluctuates much more considerably depending on our metabolic health.
So then how does gaining metabolic flexibility come in here that we talked, I was emailing you about, a lot of people, it's all about metabolic flexibility. So we're burning fat as fuel as our main fuel tank, but we're able to have the flexibility shift back to carb fuel and have that ability to shift back and forth. And then I was saying some people might be inflexible, that they can't go from fat to carbs, as well as carb people can't go back to fat. So how would you say is the importance or the priority of gaining metabolic flexibility or not? Is that an issue?
So I think that we definitely want to be considering our ability to metabolize these macronutrients, but I don't think of it in terms of metabolic flexibility, largely for the reasons I was just mentioning, where in general, we can be burning both at the same time. We can have different, our muscles at rest can be burning fats and our brain can be burning glucose for fuel. We can have those at the same time. We can be taking them in at the same time. There's not an issue with that physiologically. We can have certain mitochondria burning one fuel and others burning another. And so we definitely want to be able to do that. And I just tend to focus more on the blocks that are going on in terms of carb metabolism, because any issues with fat metabolism tend to be a result of that. I would basically say that fat metabolism is the default state. Whether we're under stress, whether we're struggling with, metabolically with insulin resistance, whether we just don't eat, if we're doing anything that is less than like a very insulin sensitive like good metabolic, someone in good metabolic health, we will be relying on fat metabolism. And so when it comes to metabolic flexibility, I think it's an aside. I think it's not really an area that, at least from my view, warrants much focus outside of the idea that we do want to be able to burn carbohydrates. And I think part of the reason for the misunderstanding is because people look at a state like diabetes or any other stress state as a situation where someone's burning carbohydrates. And there is glycolysis going on, like there's lactate metabolism where the glucose is coming in and going through glycolysis to lactate, but it's not making it through the rest of mitochondrial respiration, through the Krebs cycle, through the electron transport chain. So there is quote unquote carb metabolism going on, but it is strongly inhibited. It is not full and it's not oxidative. It's not actually using the oxygen. And so I think the idea that is an issue in like that carb metabolism is happening there and not fat is just a complete mischaracterization of the real problem there.
So just to wrap up this section, then I want to get into fasting, your thoughts on fasting exercise. How are you improving carb metabolism? Can you just summarize that?
Yeah. So of course, a lot of this will depend on where someone's at, but taking out some of the biggest offenders is normally where I would start. So the first place I would look at is the polyunsaturated fats. And these are getting a lot of attention now as far as the seed oils, right, being huge issues. And part of the reason for that is because they're major disruptors to our ability to respire, our mitochondrial respiration, our metabolic function. And so that's a huge one, is removing or reducing PUFA considerably from our diets, the polyunsaturated fats, the omega-6s, the omega-3s, and shifting toward the more saturated, if not at least monounsaturated fats. And then from the carbohydrate side, focusing on the easily digested carbohydrates. So the ones that are not driving any sort of gut symptoms, bloating and issues from there. And so many people have these gut dysbioses, right? And they have this intestinal permeability. And so they will tend to struggle much more so with carbohydrates feeding those harmful bacteria as opposed to other foods. And so that will vary on the individual. For most people, if they're just shifting toward the well-cooked roots and tubers and some ripe fruits, those are normally fine as far as digestibility goes. If someone's still struggling with those, then look more intently and closely at resolving the gut issues that are there underlying. So that would be kind of the second piece, is looking at gut health. And of course, there can be some issues digesting protein and fat as well, but gut health, polyunsaturated fats, of course, nutrients are important, right? We need our B vitamins, we need our magnesium, copper and iron and zinc, and all of these vitamins and minerals that are very directly involved with our carb metabolism. And then I would say another one, probably the last one that maybe is important as a foundational piece, is regulating blood sugar. Something you mentioned before. And when we're at a point where our blood sugar is dysregulated and we're dealing with these excess stress hormones, the counter-regulatory hormones, which are the glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol, when those are being produced due to drops in blood sugar, those inhibit our ability to produce energy effectively from carbohydrates. They inhibit that oxidative metabolism, shift us into a state where we're metabolically inflexible because we can't burn the carbohydrates. And so, it's also a state that happens to involve turning the thyroid activity down, increasing fat storage, and on from there. So getting the blood sugar balanced, I would say of course, it can be a slightly complex solution here, but I would say eating regularly, maybe every 3 to 5 hours, as opposed to fasting, which I guess we'll talk about in a second. Maybe this is a nice segue. But I'd say eating every 3 to 5 hours, including carbohydrates with each of those meals, as well as some protein and fat, tends to be a good way to balance blood sugar. And just as a quick counterpoint to the person who might say, my blood sugar is really balanced when I'm not eating carbs, I would say yes, but it's balanced by those counter-regulatory stress hormones. You're relying on the glucagon especially, and then also some adrenaline and cortisol, and all those have effects on the metabolic rate via affecting the conversion of thyroid hormones, among other things. And so it's kind of like the same thing as saying that you've fixed diabetes by avoiding carbohydrates, where you haven't actually fixed the carb metabolism, you're just avoiding it. I would say the same thing is true if you're not taking in carbohydrates, you're not actually fixing a blood sugar regulation, you're just avoiding it.
Yeah, great points and things to think about for sure. So another big topic I want to jump into is, of course, fasting exercise, because this is a hot topic. And a lot of people, including myself years ago, I was doing, for example, I think 5 years ago, or more, a lot of not eating because I would, 10 years ago, I was doing the fat coffee, and then I was training clients. I owned a fitness studio, and then I run with the client. I go to master swimming, and then suddenly I wouldn't get home till say 3 o'clock to have a meal. And I think I got myself in trouble with my hormones not eating enough for my energy output. So balancing that out, but also, causing more stress. And so I'm really trying to educate listeners to really think about, are you fasting too much? When you thinking maybe less is more, and work on performance longevity. And of course, fat loss is people's goal too, but fasting in itself, then fasting exercise. And then I'm trying to put together an ebook for females, because if you're cycling female, there's a lot of research that, 12 hours overnight, like dinner to breakfast, is enough. So why don't you just kind of talk about your thoughts on fasting in general, then tie in the endurance athlete?
Sure. So I think the biggest question with fasting is, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the goal here, and what's the potential benefit? And I think in many ways it comes back to a couple of the same things that I mentioned earlier in terms of, the lower carb approach, which is a huge benefit to our gut for someone who is having gut issues. Although I'd prefer to get that same benefit by just removing the issues in terms of foods that are coming in, and also resolving the gut health in the first place. Again, kind of got this theme here of avoiding the issue, where if the foods that are coming in are causing issues digestively and you just don't take any food in, you're avoiding the issue and you'll feel better. Of course, I'm not saying that's like you will get that benefit short term, but I'd much prefer to allow for a state where your gut health is better so you can eat without those issues, and kind of parallel to the blood sugar regulation side, the insulin resistance side with carbohydrates. So I think that's one very clear benefit from fasting, but I'd prefer to get it elsewhere. The other, kind of coming back to the fat burning, where that can be helpful if someone's struggling with carb burning. At least you've got some sort of fuel going through and producing some energy. And then the last, major effect from fasting I would point to is the stress effect. It's creating a lot of stress, and a lot of, this is falling under that umbrella of hormesis, where we are trying to include the right amount of stress to create some sort of potential benefit. Trying to drive autophagy. We're trying to increase mitochondrial biogenesis, and on from there. And I have some major issues with the idea of hormesis. And in general, I don't think that is a great way to achieve benefits. But one thing I will say is, I'm happy to dive into that. But for someone who is an endurance athlete, or an athlete in general, you're already incurring a lot of stress. You're already driving enough of all the exact same pathways that fasting would create, or cold thermogenesis, or resveratrol, whatever else you're trying to do. You're already activating all those pathways with your exercise. You're driving the release of the stress hormones. You're increasing the production of reactive oxygen species. You're activating all those hormetic adaptive pathways. You're creating the mitochondrial biogenesis, the autophagy. That signal is already there from your training. And the idea, if you're in terms of the research and physiology of hormesis, is that there's a narrow window, and I don't agree with this, but even if you wanted to say that view is correct, the idea is that there's a narrow window where we just need the right amount of stress. It's not too much and it's not too little, and that's where we get these benefits. If you're already an athlete or in endurance training, then I think you've already hit that mark at least. And so the idea that we would want to add more stress on top, I think, is going way past that ideal Goldilocks zone. And instead, I would be focusing way more on the things that are trying to lead to recovery and keeping the stress low outside of that training. I would say that that's already more than enough. And I would say that in reality, we can talk about in terms of hormesis, but I have some issues with the idea that the stress is actually beneficial in the first place.
Yeah, I think I've said that a lot on my show lately, past couple of years, but I think goes with what I say, the Goldilocks effect for everything, finding the right dose of exercise, what you're eating, your sleep, your stressors, because really when the hormetic stress came out with the cold therapy and, plunge pools, everyone's doing it. And then everyone started, I know someone's doing it this year every day for 10 minutes. It was their whole goal, and doing video of it every day. It's like, is that even beneficial when we're doing it every day? Hormetic stress is supposed to be a short dose, a blast of stress, and then you recover from it. But when you're doing all these stressors that are supposed to be a positive, you recover and repair and rebuild and get stronger from that, become more resilient. But then when we're doing like HIIT training every day, if you're doing cold therapy, and like you're saying, I've said that a lot. And I think that's where I see chronic stress accumulates and you have that beaker of stress and you only can take that much, and then it overfulls and causes all these imbalances and metabolic chaos within your body. And then you're like, oh, what did I do wrong? Like when I got my adrenal exhaustion, whatever, there's air quotes because it's not what it's called, in March 2013, I suddenly gained 30 pounds and I didn't change anything. I just got off doing an amazing Ironman season. I did a marathon and I was like just super fit athlete and really efficient burning fat. But I broke myself down and all my body systems got burned out, whatever you want to call it. But that's what I'm trying to share with people, that finding that less is more and finding that right dose. So we're improving our performance in life and sports, but also improving your future self is what I say all the time. Like when I'm 80, what am I going to be doing? How am I going to be living? I want to be thriving every day, not surviving the day. So I'm really trying to send home that message to our endurance athletes who are just burning the candle at both ends every day. You know, avoid getting broken. Here's tools how you can take control of what you're doing now and make it optimal benefit from it. So that's why I kind of was curious to bring you on the show to share that. So hormesis, you're saying, isn't great. Like what's their best way to really improve our performance longevity then?
Yeah. So my issue with like the main, I guess I should say, so the main idea of hormesis is that the small amount of stress from whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether it's cold thermogenesis or fasting or exercise or a little bit of mercury, some toxic heavy metals, doesn't matter. As long as you're creating a little bit of stress, our body adapts to it and gets stronger and healthier as a result. And my central issue here is that some of these things that are definitely beneficial, whether it's exercise or fasting, at least in the short term, things like that. My argument here is that they're not actually beneficial because of the stress. They're beneficial because of all these other effects that they have, like with the fasting, a lot of gut relief. That's a massive benefit, or relief from poor glucose metabolism. That's a big benefit. So my argument is that these things are beneficial for other reasons than the stress, for what's called their specific effects. And so when it comes to exercise, I think there's a ton of benefits here. And again, there can be benefits to the fasting as well, but I would so much prefer to get those benefits, at least from something like fasting, without the stress. With the exercise, I would prefer to, it's tougher to get the exact same benefit without stress. Some stress is going to be directly paired with exercise because it requires a lot of energy usage, but I'd much rather do it in a way that is not excessively stressful, right? And an athlete not only intuitively knows this, but we know this now as we've learned more and more about how to train properly. You don't want to just go all out with, super long endurance training every single day, especially if you're preparing for an event. You work your way up and kind of do smaller amounts, and then you titrate or have certain harder days and things like that, and really focus on recovery. And so when it comes to exercise, that, my focus would be on doing kind of a minimal effective dose for whatever your goals are, and then doing a lot to make sure you're recovering from the stress there that is going to happen regardless. But what this also leads to is this idea that we don't want to just be doing things because they cause stress. And so it leads to a bit of a questioning of whether we want to be doing all of the fasting and the cold thermogenesis and the low carb diets that are all working through these stress mechanisms. And I don't think everyone is aware of that also, that the reason these things are supposed to be beneficial is because they create oxidative stress all the way down in the mitochondrial, the cellular level, and that activates all these different pathways that are then supposed to, lead to these backup responses like the autophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis. But it's all adding into that same bucket and can certainly come at a cost, like you've mentioned, like you experienced. And so I'd much prefer to be more judicious about what things that we're doing that are stressful, and then focusing a lot more on recovery and on getting those same unique benefits to something like fasting without the stress, which would involve just restoring gut health and eating foods that are well digested and well absorbed, so that you're not creating the same production of lipopolysaccharide, the same intestinal permeability that you might be when you're not eating well, or, on from there.
So doing less chronic stress and improving just shorter amount of stress, but focusing more on the recovery from stressors and measuring heart rate variability. How do you know if you're doing the right thing for a person, or how does someone measure if they're doing the right dose?
Yeah, I mean, those biometrics can be really helpful, right? Whether you're using heart rate variability or looking at your heart rate, changing overnight. Also, how well you're recovering in terms of how well is your next workout? How are you feeling beforehand? I think the way that we feel can tell us a lot. How well are we sleeping? Like, is this something that's interfering with our sleep? Are we sleeping so much extra because we can't recover properly? How do we feel physically? Are we super sore? Are we mentally acute? Are we focused? Or are we struggling? Is our mood down? Do we want to do the workout? I think that we can determine a lot just by considering how we're feeling, but we can also use some of those biometrics too, that can also give us a pretty good indication of whether our bodies are actually recovering well.
And then what blood markers would you want people to look at if you're having clients? Like, are you looking at insulin, C-reactive protein? What do you choose to start people with when you're doing lab testing? Blood chemistry.
Those things are certainly helpful. I mean, I think normally when I'm doing lab testing, I'm looking to answer a particular question. So if somebody has issues that seem to point to some sort of liver dysfunction or some issues with glucose metabolism, then I might be trying to look at certain markers that are directly tied with those things. If we're just looking at kind of some basic markers to look at, I think thyroid's super helpful, not just TSH, but certainly looking at TSH, also looking at T3, T4, but especially reverse T3, which you mentioned earlier. I can't tell you how many people I've seen who their TSH is fine, but they're very clearly hypothyroid. And sometimes you'll see that elevated reverse T3 because they're not converting the T4 to T3. Sometimes you also see really sky-high cholesterol, which directly ties with thyroid activity. So those would certainly be a few that I would look at. CRP is definitely helpful. Looking at fasting glucose, looking at fasting insulin, looking at the hormones, of course, looking at cortisol rhythms. Those things all have their place and can be important information if we're having trouble just determining those things, or if we want some extra information there.
And then going back to biohacking, stacking or hacks, biohacks, everyone I know is so into like the PEMF mat and then recovery boots and sauna and cold therapy and rebounder, all these different things, and then add on all the supplements. So what's your opinion on in the biohacking world of the optimal dose for the minimal effective dose to get benefit, and what is fine? What do you find is good or not good for people? Like if we should bother with any of it or just do, get outside and walk in the morning sunshine.
That's always a good thing. Definitely always a fan of that. There's, so a lot of it would depend on the individual intervention that we're looking at. I think when it comes to recovery, and we touched on this before, you were asking about macros and I never gave you a clear answer, but I would say getting enough carbohydrates and calories in is by far and away the biggest thing that we can do to get our stress levels back down to recover. If we've depleted ourselves of glycogen, we need to replenish that glycogen, and you can do it through protein, or you can try to use the glycerol backbones from your triglycerides, and that requires a lot of stress activity. It's very inefficient, which is why our bodies don't favor it. You have to use about 30% of the energy that you would get from the glucose that you create just to produce the glucose. So it's a really inefficient process, and if you want to recover and take that stress off your liver and not turn your thyroid down in the process, replenishing the glycogen that you're using during your exercise, I think is so important. Getting enough fuel in, getting enough sleep, let's get those foundations in place. Absolutely. Get your sunlight. And then I would maybe look to some extra recovery tools. I will say I'm not working with the elite athletes that really need to focus on those specific interventions. So I don't have a few kind of key recommendations here, whether it's, I know you're mentioning some of these different, some of the different technology, and I'm not familiar enough with it to say, I can give some thoughts based on how they work, but I don't have a great few top ones to use.
Yeah, I just be thinking of the people I know that listen to Ben Greenfield for years, and all those type of podcasts that they come back with taking this supplement, this stack, and this device and everything. I always okay, do we really need to spend all that money and all those tools when we have nature to work on and breathing exercises? And I always look for the free stuff, breathing through my nose and just taking a pause and reset, going for a walk outside, and unplugging my phone and social media and turn everything in airplane mode. I think so much of that is more beneficial in my mind than buying all the different devices and supplements and everything. Start with, like you said, foundations, but work on your, eating whole foods, in season, local, and getting your exercise, getting your movement, getting exposure to sunlight is more important than all the other stuff, I think, for sure, to start with.
Definitely. And unless somebody is working toward a very particular athletic goal, I think we shouldn't be doing so much exercise that we have to use those really extreme techniques for recovery anyway. And again, if someone is trying to do a triathlon or they're in some sort of competitive athletic event, then yes, we are going to need to train probably to a point, or we really want to optimize it to a point where it might be a little bit more than we would need just from a health standpoint. And we might want to look to some of those techniques for really excelled recovery. But for the average person, or for the majority of people, even who are in athletics, who are doing it more to stay healthy and fit and for the joy of it, I would say also we should be able to exercise in a way that doesn't require such rigorous and expensive things to recover. If we are needing that, then maybe we want to reconsider exactly how much exercise or how we're doing the exercise that we are doing.
Well, that's what I say, as someone that I did 15 Ironmans and I don't know how many marathons and 50K trail runs when I was able to do it. Now I don't really have any interest, but I don't think my body could do it anyways. But I think it is looking at the less is more and the minimal effective dose for your workouts. And as I'm an aging athlete, focus on, as we talked last week at the KetoCon conference on the fitness panel, lift heavy weights, focus on lifting weights and strength training versus doing the chronic cardio and thinking you're getting healthy doing that. Get movement throughout the day is one thing. There's movement and there's exercise. And I think movement, walking throughout the day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, eat time, actually, to me, I always say means get out, move. And then your exercise is going to be more strength training that, like I did this morning. I got my heart rate up doing, combined movements with upper body, lower body, or doing a bicep curl and a squat or a lunge and the step up and something, combining things that I was sweating. So I'm not going to do, I hate cardio machines, and I never even go on them if I don't have to. But, that's what I think people need to remember is to get effective results from your workout program isn't doing excessive cardio that adds to be another thing in your stress bucket. So.
Yeah. And just to beat a dead horse here, as someone who used to worked out as consistently as you could, it was at least 4 days a week. I was in the gym at least an hour for years and years. I put so much effort toward doing that and had such a small result relative to when I bumped up the amount of calories and carbohydrates I was taking in, and how I could spend, I would say, around 50% of the time that I did before working out, and gained incredibly more strength and muscle than, at the time. That was like my main focus, which is not anymore. And I'm not, a lean 205 like I was at that point. But it was so much easier. And that was with less volume, less training, focusing on the strength training, not doing the excessive cardio, but eating a lot more and eating actually to my needs, which I thought I was doing, but found out later on that I actually needed large amounts of carbohydrates. And just for reference, I mean, I'm talking over 600 grams a lot of days during that period of time. And I think a lot of people who are, athletes need considerable amount of carbohydrates.
I keep muting myself, so I forget if I turned it on or not. So with that, I'll kind of finish up. Last question would be, as I was just at KetoCon, people that want to test their ketones and be in nutritional ketosis and show that they're burning ketones while they're doing a bike ride or whatnot. So do you say like anything to do with nutritional ketosis to have that dual fuel for your brain, or just eat more carbs, not measure your glucose? What's your take on that? And then we'll wrap it up with find more in your podcast and your blog. And I know because you have tons of stuff on your website. So give me your little thoughts on being in NK, nutritional ketosis.
Yeah. And I spent time there and I have not gone back, and there's a reason for it. I think we've been duped in a lot of a way to think that is the way to health. And I really strongly don't think that's the case. I think we can question what is it what are the supposed benefits that we're supposed to be getting here? And I think that it really all comes back down to hormesis. And I really don't think that is a good argument, that the reason why we want to be in ketosis is because it drives the small amount of stress and we get some extra autophagy and things. And it's obviously a complex topic that there's a lot of details to. So, and I've got a couple of articles that really dig into it, and some podcast episodes that I'll reference and, at the end here that dig into that more, because that's a really long conversation. But what I'm kind of getting at is I don't think that for the vast majority of people, it is beneficial to be in ketosis. And I think people are much better off not being in that state while also doing the things that keto accomplishes, coming back to the gut health and achieving the quote metabolic flexibility. But in reality, I think carb metabolism is where the focus should be there anyway. So I'm not a fan of getting into that ketotic state. And it's tough to like kind of put it onto a little piece, because we really have to dig into the mechanisms of why it would even be beneficial in the first place, which I think a lot of people don't question. And I think that's part of the problem here. But what I would say is that the ketogenic state is the starvation state, it's the famine state, and that involves all of the things that our bodies do to conserve energy. When we're in a famine, when we are starving, our bodies are trying to conserve as much energy as possible so they can survive. If they didn't do that, we would die much quicker. And so what that involves is turning down thyroid activity, right? Inhibiting that conversion from the T4 to T3, raising stress hormones, at least via glucagon, but also typically involves considerable elevations in adrenaline and cortisol. Basically, anytime we have increased energy demands, because those are the things that drive increased fat burning, increased fat oxidation, and increased lipolysis from the fat stores to get some of that fat. So, and then that leads to issues in terms of reproductive hormone production, issues with cycles, from the female side, issues with digestion, and on from there. And so I basically, to kind of put it into some real basic terms, I view keto as the same as a kind of starvation state, puts our bodies in essentially a low battery mode, a low battery state where they're trying to conserve energy. And I think that's the exact opposite of what we want to do.
Yeah. So I think that's, good to say that's why you have a podcast and you have a blog, because it is a huge conversation and you're bringing a lot of people. I know Brad Kearns was saying like made you kind of stop and think twice. And I've said this for years, because when I was doing a ton of fasting, and I still have to catch myself, like I haven't eaten yet today and it's 11 o'clock, but I did have calories in coffee, but I'm not hungry. So it is always like, okay, is what I'm doing serving me a purpose? Is it achieving anything? And what's my why? Because I think a lot of times we do things and we're not getting desired results. Like if someone's trying to lose weight and they're doing all this fasting and nothing, they're not getting anything, what they want out of it, they have to stop. Okay, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So maybe you should, like some people can, adjust their macros, get more protein, work on what you're saying, like work on your carb metabolism, look at what's the broken part in your body causing you not to have the ability to burn fat, and work on more digging deeper, like investigating what your why is, what's the missing piece of your puzzle to be your optimal self, to improve your metabolism, improve your performance, longevity, right?
I probably should make the caveat at this point, just talking about endurance training. That is a state that there are some unique features there, fat burning. And so there are some unique aspects there where you do want to make sure that it might be beneficial if you're doing something like an Ironman, you're going to be having to rely on fat. You might want to be in a ketogenic state in situations like that. And there might be situations where you want to train in that same state as well. So that is kind of a caveat here, just kind of an important distinction or disclaimer to make, that it's different from just talking about this in terms of health versus an extreme endurance sport, where there are some unique things there that might lead to an extra, wanting to have an extra reliance on fat or ketones. But that also doesn't mean that translates to, I know you're talking about so much of the advice for someone who's not metabolically healthy, not necessarily translating to someone who's metabolically healthy. But at the same time, someone who's in an extreme endurance sport, the advice there might not also necessarily translate to someone who's metabolically healthy, but not doing that.
Yeah, great points. So where can people find you? Let's share your podcast and your website, and you've got tons of information on there. So how do people get started in learning more from you?
Yeah, definitely. So my podcast is the Energy Balance Podcast, and my website is jayfeldmanwellness.com. And there's a ton of free information there, articles discussing, calories in, calories out, and hormesis, and the importance of carbohydrates and regulating blood sugar. And I've also packaged a lot of the really important points there into a free mini course that includes some information, some of the specifics maybe we didn't talk as much about today, as far as how many carbs we want, what some of those sources might look like, and things like that. And so, yeah, that free 7-day mini course can be found at jayfeldmanwellness.com/energy.
Great. I will put all the links in the show notes, and people can put their comments here and questions so we can answer them, because I know there'll be lots, and we will see what we can do to answer those questions. But I think it's just great to stop, pause, and reset maybe reflect on what you could do differently in your program if you're not getting the desired results, because I think everyone just follows what they hear online and other people. And what I always say too, I learned from yoga that comparison is a thief of joy. So you need to really not try to be somebody else, but be your best self and figure out what you need to do. What are the tools, what adjustments and course correction you need to do to look your best, feel your best, and perform your best in life for now. But also, as I say all the time, again, is that future self is really important to me, what I'm going to be doing when I'm at a parent's age, and be able to thrive and not struggle. So I think something to think about for those high charging individuals that try to do more and more.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on, Debbie.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepotts.net. You can help us to continue to grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.